What you heard in the introductions, the short version of that biography is I'm a journalist. I have been for a long time. So I want to make clear that I'm not a mental health expert. In fact, as a journalist, I'm not an expert on anything. People yourselves, the parents and families and friends of people suffering from mental illness are really the experts because you have the lived experience. That's what expertise really means. Your experiences have given you this incredible breadth of knowledge about everything from medicine to the health system. And I'm sure it's an education that you don't wish on anyone, but an education that's nonetheless valuable. Now, I can't match that expertise in any way, but what I hope I can do tonight is provide you a little bit of context and a different way of looking at what you're living. Again, you heard through the introduction, I've been writing about mental health and health generally for a long time, a little more than 30 years. So I have a little bit of idea of the challenges that families live, because I have the privilege of talking to families and patients all the time. You know better than I, that mental illness is not an individual problem. It's really a family problem, a family illness. And the vast majority of the care, we forget this, but the vast majority of care in this country is not provided by doctors or nurses. It's provided by families. And by families, I mean mums, of course, because the dads don't tend to do a lot. Occasionally they do, but that's the reality. I think I've also learned over the years that you experience a lot of frustrations. That's what we tend to write about in the media, is the bad stuff. And there's a lot of frustration, especially in this field. Now, unfortunately, tonight I can't give you any magical solutions. Again, what I'm going to try to do is help you, I hope, understand the larger mental health care system. Why is it the way it is, with all its failings? And some of the larger ethical and policy challenges. And maybe, if I do a good job, maybe a little bit of hope at the end of the night that things will get a little better in the years to come. So as a journalist, my job is very simple. My job is to tell stories. We tell stories, usually about individuals, to illustrate policies and policy failures. So that's what we do. Sometimes we do stupid things like run pictures of people on a bridge. We don't do that anymore, thankfully, but the media is not always good. We make mistakes, and it's good to have people call us to task, and that's great. But as a storyteller, what I want to do tonight is mostly tell you a story. It's a story that will probably be eerily familiar to some of you. It's a story about a family, about a person. It's a story of a young man. Well, he's not young anymore, but when I first met him, he was young, and his name's Jonah. So Jonah is the son of a man, Howard Flux Gold, who's a former colleague of mine, a former journalist at the Globe and Mail, and someone who over the years has become quite an outspoken advocate for people with mental illness, and especially for their families. So let me tell you a bit about Jonah. Jonah was raised in Vancouver in a comfortable middle-class home, an area a little bit like Dorval. He was a student in the gifted program, so quite a brilliant student, a superior athlete, popular classmate. He had a loving and supportive family, had everything going for him. He graduated from the University of British Columbia, and then he started a master's degree in film studies in Concordia. He moved to Montreal. He really had it all. He had his future set up for him. But then Jonah got sick. These things often happen in your late teens, early adult years. He started hearing voices, stopped going to classes because he was convinced that he was being spied on and that he was being targeted by assassins. He dropped out of school, made his way back home eventually. Of course, his parents were far away. They had only a slight inkling of what was going on. Now, his family was well connected, so he got help. They realized he was sick. They got him help, but he didn't want help. Now, the first time Jonah was arrested was because he was jumping up and down on cars on the busy Burrard Street Bridge. If you know Vancouver, you know the big bridge downtown. So he got arrested for that. He was doing, crazy stuff in roads. And several incidents like this happened. Now, since then, he's been arrested and jailed in 4 provinces and a number of US states. All kinds of crimes, and I use that term in quotes. In Saskatoon, he was trying to sneak into the Juno Awards. He made his way there. I guess a music fan. I got arrested for that. In Banff, it was indecent exposure for peeing on somebody's lawn. Elsewhere, in Ontario, it was a couple of drug offenses. In Toronto, he kissed a stranger on an elevator. That stranger happened to be a very well-known lawyer, so he was prosecuted and jailed for sexual assault. essentially, the shorter version of the story is he became a criminal instead of a patient. Very familiar story, unfortunately. Now, he's not a dangerous criminal. I outlined some of his crimes. But he's ill. He's been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. Essentially a combination of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And again, in this audience, you're familiar with what that means, so I won't give explanations. So what lessons can we take from his predicament, which is actually quite common? Now, I think the first one is that, mental illness is the only condition that, health condition that routinely engages police, the courts, and the prison system. That doesn't happen for heart disease, for cancer, or anything. We don't send those people to jail when they're sick. So why do our encounters with those who are suffering from mental illness lead to incarceration instead of provoking compassion, which is what they should do? I think part of the answer to that question lies in history. And there's a long, detailed history of how we've treated mental illness, and you probably know it fairly well. But essentially for centuries, dating back to the Middle Ages and even before that, the behaviors exhibited by people with mental illnesses, some of the stuff that Jonah does and people have done for thousands of years, those behaviors were treated as moral failings. They weren't treated as medical problems. So that's a well-ingrained notion, a wrong notion, but well-ingrained in society. Because mental illnesses are invisible, they happen inside the brain and they don't have physical manifestations that we can see most of the time, like smallpox or whatever disease is well known through time. We're a little bit more frightened of them because we don't know what's going on in that person's head. People with mental illness, people again like Jonah, they essentially don't conform to societal norms, and that's always been problematic through time. We've always treated them as sinners, and today we call sinners criminals. But it's always been that same problem through ancient history through to today. Now, a more contemporary problem, and you heard some of the books that I wrote. My most recent book is essentially a history of Medicare. So one of the quirks of Medicare, so we created our Medicare system in Canada, which we love and everyone admires. So it was created in the 1950s and 60s, essentially to give free care to Canadians who needed it. It pays for hospital and physician services. That's essentially what Medicare is. But interestingly, psychiatric hospitals, which at the time we called asylums, were left out of Medicare, and they were left out deliberately. Not many people know this history. They were left out because they were considered part of the penal system, part of the jail system, and not part of the medical system. So they remained a provincial responsibility to fund, whereas hospitals, real hospitals, became funded by the federal government. So we had this immediate division. And what happened at this point in the 50s and 60s is the care went down precipitously because there was a lot less money suddenly. And there was also a message saying that this isn't important. We're going to stop funding that. And as you know, a lot of psychiatric institutions are sort of hidden away in the country. We've always hidden people away. And we didn't see this degradation. It wasn't that visible, but it occurred. Now, at the same time, and this was part and parcel of this policy, was deinstitutionalization. And again, in this audience, you know what that is. The closure of mental health facilities, sending people out to communities. Now, this was in part a civil rights initiative. We don't want to lock people up who aren't criminals, and that was well-intentioned and a good idea to a certain extent. But it was also predominantly about money because of the defunding of hospitals. Now, if I have a chance, or if you have questions, I can say more about deinstitutionalization later, but I think you know what the results were. The results were tragic. When patients were released into the community, they were essentially released into nothing. They were supposed to be programs. We were going to take the money and fund programs. It was all very lovely, flowery, and lovely, and a little guitar and Peter, Paul, and Mary. When we talked about this, it was going to be wonderful. Now, the reality is different. The reality is people ended up on the streets and they ended up in jail. They didn't end up in community programs, but some groups, many groups like this one, formed to try and fill the void. But it's impossible for you to do the work that a system should be doing, and you just don't have the money or the manpower to do it. Now, the ultimate irony of this is people essentially ended up back in the penal system where they had begun. But they ended up with jail guards instead of nurses, and they ended up behind bars instead of in nice country institutions with lawns and places to go and to be cared for. So it's a really shift, not for the better. Now, you'll know in this audience, and most people who think about it for more than a moment will know that if you jail people who suffer from mental illness, it'll have absolutely no dissuasive effect. That's the idea of jailing. You're going to teach people a lesson, they won't repeat their crimes. It also has no therapeutic benefit. In fact, quite the opposite. A lot of people with mental illness end up in solitary confinement. Their conditions grow far worse. And it's a vicious circle. So Howard Fluxgold, who I talked about at the outset, Jonah's dad, he's told police in the courts this same thing many, many times over the years. He says, you can arrest my son until the cows come home, and he's never going to learn his lesson. He's sick. He's not a criminal. Now, the written word can't begin to convey the frustration of his voice when he tells these stories. And I've written about Jonah. He's given me permission to write about him many times over the years in different examples of stories. And what he feels is probably something all of you have felt at some point. It's this profound exasperation with the system. Every family caring for someone with a severe mental illness knows that exasperation. So Howard says this: in whose interest is it to treat Jonah like this, to jail him? Not his interest, not his family's interest, and not society's interest. So why do we do it? It's a very good question. What his son and what everyone else in that predicament needs is treatment. But again, he doesn't want treatment. There's the catch. There's the worst part of the illness many times. And you know the formal term, anosognosia. I can spell it, but I can't say it. That's why I'm a print reporter. But that fancy word, meaning an inability to have awareness or insight into your illness. It's probably the worst part of conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. What does Jonah need? Well, he needs long-term care. He needs a place to live. He needs some stability. He needs a basic income, some medication, some monitoring to make sure he's been taking his medication. And sometimes he needs to be forced into treatment against his will. And so do a lot of people with severe mental illnesses, because they're a danger to themselves and they're a danger to others when they're untreated. Now, I've written this, again, many times over the years, and it makes me very unpopular with certain groups, especially with civil liberties groups. We live in a society where individual rights are seen as supreme over collective rights or over the rights of families. So saying this is heresy, but I've come to believe it's really important to say it. Howard, like so many parents, has seen this zealous interpretation of civil rights destroy his child's life, and he wants to have nothing to do with it. The paramount right of a patient should be treatment. It should be getting better. The health system has done a grave disservice to people like Jonah and others by letting the lawyers take over. It's really easy to make a theoretical argument about someone has rights, but what if those rights are making them sicker and worse and endangering their lives? And worse than the civil liberties are the privacy laws, because privacy laws, again, well-intentioned, really good things about privacy laws, but they place barriers in front of families who want to help at every single turn. So Mr. Fluxgold, Sr., he doesn't hear from his son very often. Again, this is not uncommon, ties have been broken off. He only gets calls when? He gets calls from his son when he wants bail money. The family has stopped, like most families, they refuse to post bail because they know it's always going to be lost because they're not going to respect the conditions. Sometimes he gets a call when there's a warrant issued for Jonah's arrest because he doesn't appear in court, which again, he doesn't do, doesn't make sense to him. So Howard says this: they call me looking for information when the shit hits the fan. The police call, the courts call, the lawyers call. But when I ask them basic questions about my son, they say, oh, sorry, privacy, 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 blah, blah, blah. Again, I'm sure you all know these stories. That we spend so much money jailing and hunting down people with mental illness who commit minor offenses, instead of spending those precious dollars on prevention and treatment, I don't think it can be described as anything else but a perversity. but we do it. That's the system is built wrong. There's really not a mental health system to speak of in Canada. We have a health system with a little bit of a mental health component. What we have, though, for very sick people, for people with severe mental illness, is a legal system, a system that helps them stay sick and helps them get sicker by jailing them. So how sick is that? You know, I think that's a question we have to ask of our politicians and policymakers. Now, when I talk about this, people say, well, what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting we strap people down and drug them against their will? Maybe sometimes. But I think what we really need to do is acknowledge that refusing treatment is rarely a rational choice. It's part of an illness, and an illness that needs to be treated. It's really the most bedeviling symptom of a severe mental illness. As I mentioned, Jonah has systematically refused treatment. Again, not unusual. And how does this make any sense? How can someone be deemed not criminally responsible, which he usually is when he gets to court, when they see how sick he is? On the one hand, he's deemed non-criminally responsible, but on the other, he's allowed to say no to treatment. Where's the logic in those two things? There isn't. I think it needs to be said, too, that the rights granted to people suffering from severe mental illness are largely illusory. How are they benefiting from wonderful civil rights if they're sitting in jail? A place where those suffering from mental illness are targets. They're targets for sexual and physical abuse and for, as I said, for solitary confinement. What good are those much vaunted civil rights when they're living on the streets or smoking crack cocaine and selling their body for the next fix, which is again a reality. How much freedom can you truly enjoy if you're being consumed by a terrifying brain disease that compels you to slash your wrists or harm yourself in other ways? I think instead of sentencing people with mental illness to jail time for petty crimes, we should sentence them, and I use that in quotes, to treatment. And thankfully this approach is starting. It's starting on a small scale. Around the country we're seeing the creation of mental health courts and a more creative use of treatment orders, for example. Involuntary committal orders and treatment orders of all sorts. And those are very successful. And most people who get them and stay in the programs are actually very thankful retrospectively. They become the advocates against the civil rights zealots eventually. Now there also has to be programs that help people. It's not just a question of forcing them to get treatment, you have to do the follow-up work. That's lovely. I can't sing as well as the singers, I'll make it. You have to have these backup programs. You have to have monitoring of the treatment as well. Sometimes you have to stand there while people take their pills. And we do that in other conditions. We do it with tuberculosis, is seen as right. Why not with mental illness? There has to be blood and urine testing to ensure that people are actually taking their drugs and not taking other drugs. For those who have real trouble complying with their meds, there can be long-lasting injections and implantable medications, which are actually very effective now and very safe. People like Jonah need some or all of these things if they're going to get their lives back and if they're going to get on track and live up to their potential. And that's ultimately what everyone deserves in society, to live up to their potential. And he had a lot, and it's been frittered away. He's had some community treatment orders over the years, but again, each time he gets back on his feet, he discontinues treatment and spirals down again. Again, a well-known story in a room like this. Now, Jonah today is almost 40. He, of course, looks much older because he's been on the streets for almost 2 decades. He has no money, never has, bounces from one jail to the next. Usually he just is given bus fare to get out of town. That's usually the most popular mental health treatment in cities. We keep it quiet, but that's the reality. Get on the bus, go somewhere else, but that's his problem. He routinely gets beaten up because of the way he behaves, says inappropriate things. He self-medicates with street drugs, has no meaningful relationships, which is one of the saddest things about severe mental illness, the loneliness and the loss of ties to other people. He's tried killing himself many times. Once he slashed his own throat with a knife right in the courtroom. Howard says this, Howard Fluxgold, "It's not what we dream of for our kids." You know, that's the understatement. It's something every family knows. Every time his phone rings, for the past 20 years, he fears it's going to be police telling him that his son is dead, that he's been tasered or shot, or worse yet, that he's harmed someone because of his illness. Like many parents in this situation, Mr. Fluxgold is often tempted to give up. When he talks about his situation, he does so with brutal honesty. That's because he's a journalist. You know, he admits that his son is manipulative and nasty and abusive because of his illness. Quote, "He's not a nice person, but he's still my son." And again, that's the dilemma of families. And he says this, "I'm not letting the system abandon him, no matter what. You can't just throw people like Jonah under the bus." So, that was a long and depressing story. Probably a familiar one. So, what are some of the lessons from Jonah's story? I think the main one is one, again, that you already know, that the burden on caregivers is tremendous, often is as big as on the patient, because the caregivers have a bigger realization of what's going on. But what about what Howard said? Is the system throwing people with mental illness under the bus? I don't think this answer to that question is simple. You know, it's more benign neglect than it is deliberate. I don't think the system's setting out to harm people, but it's been created in a way over the years that's just not appropriate. So that's different. In the 2 decades since Jonah was first diagnosed, there's been some dramatic changes, particularly in public attitudes. So there's some positive stuff. So I think there's 3 or 4 principal reasons for this. And for the rest of the time I have, I want to go through them quickly. I think one, we live in a society where a lot of taboos are falling, of all sorts. One of the first was the secrecy around mental illness. In the last couple of decades, there's been a real consumer revolution in healthcare. And people now speak more openly and even proudly of their health conditions. And mental health, and depression in particular, is no exception to this, and that's good. The creation of the Mental Health Commission of Canada created some formal structures that actually, for the first time, recognize the importance of mental health. And the Commission has done some good work addressing stigma in particular. Number 3, the Bell Let's Talk campaign. I think that was a watershed. Not only because of the amount of money committed. Bell initially committed $50 million. Now it's up, they've donated now $67 million in total. But beyond the money, it's really allowed business to go somewhere it's never gone before, to talk about mental illnesses like other illnesses. Finally, I think media coverage of mental health issues and suicide in particular has really changed dramatically from the days where we ran those obscene photos on the front page of a paper to a time where we're actually having serious and in-depth policy conversations about how to deal with suicide. So let me say a little bit more about each of these issues, one at a time. So the consumer revolution in healthcare started really in the late 70s, early 80s with the advent of AIDS. Until then, we had really a very paternalistic medical system, and we still do to a large extent. But, you know, research was conducted, medicine was practiced, and the media wrote about medicine in a way that was doctor knows best. That's all that mattered. Essentially, patients were to be seen and not heard, like children of yore. And they were supposed to be grateful for their care and otherwise be quiet. Health policies were dictated by the medical establishment with a little bit of assistance from, in my job, we call them disease of the week groups, like the Canadian Cancer Society, give a little input. But even those groups were dominated by health professionals and not by patients and their families. Groups like this one, the patient groups always operated on the fringes with very little money and very little official support. Now in that kind of power structure, mental health issues were totally marginalized. When AIDS came along, it hit a demographic that was young and educated and well-to-do and politically engaged, gay men. And they fought back, and very hard. They refused to sit back and let doctors tell them that, oh, sorry, this new illness, there's nothing that can be done, you're all gonna die. So that was essentially the message. There were high-profile demonstrations that got a lot of media attention. But more importantly, there was a lot of work done in the back rooms, twisting arms in political and business circles. And for the first time ever, the medical establishment was kind of relegated to the sidelines, and consumers took the floor. The idea here of gay men, of the AIDS movement in the early days, was to create a social movement, to create a community. And that was actually quite brilliantly successful. And the approach was soon copied by others, most notably women with breast cancer. Almost overnight, breast cancer went from a condition that was shameful to one where thousands of women marched in the streets proudly. And if you don't believe me, there was shame. When I started at the Globe and Mail, which was in the mid-1980s, we still didn't use the words breast cancer in the paper. That was a little too risque for my old grey Globe. We actually said women's cancer. And we certainly didn't feature first-person testimonials. That changed, and it changed very quickly. And we forget how quickly it changed. Mental health groups got on the consumer bandwagon eventually, but it took them a little more time and a little more effort, again, because they were so marginalized. There've always been mental health groups, and most of them family-oriented, like this one, but they've never had a high profile, and they've never had much money, and that's what you need to have influence. Now, as difficult as it was for women to start speaking openly about their breast cancer, it was much more difficult for people with depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia to speak out, because they had additional burdens and barriers. So let me talk a bit about the Mental Health Commission. It was created just almost a decade ago, so 2007, thanks largely to the efforts of one person, Senator Michael Kirby. Now, he doesn't talk about this a lot, but he was inspired by the plight of his sister. His sister Elizabeth suffers from severe depression. She's spent long periods of time in psychiatric hospitals because of her illness, and she's survived several suicide attempts. So there's always an underlying story to these passions. Now, the Commission, I think, marked an important turning point because it gave legitimacy and it gave institutional gravitas to the cause. Now, I've always been a big supporter of the idea of the Commission, but I think in real life it's a little bit too timid a beast. And I think probably in family circles like this one, you probably agree. But if you don't, you can tell me after. I think it makes the point well that mental illness is common and costly. The public needs to know this. About 1 in 5 Canadians suffer from mental illness. It's a tremendous economic cost, about $51 billion a year, leading cause of absenteeism and disability in Canada, and so on and so forth. So they do a good job of that. And they have a number of strategic decisions in their plan. They want to shift upstream, talk more about prevention. They want to transform relationships and uphold rights. They emphasize a lot the notion of recovery. They want to strengthen capacity in the community, which is something that's long overdue. Push from institutional care to community care, and they've really put a lot of focus on the importance of housing. Housing is really essential for the care of people with severe mental illness. And they did this study at Home Chez Soi, which was really a groundbreaking study. They talk about improving equity, that's one of their goals, making mental health services more accessible across the country, different groups. Care is particularly hard to access for children. The waits can be up to a year, which is just a disaster. They've put a little bit of emphasis on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities where there's severe mental health problems, and especially addiction and suicide, if you read the newspapers at all. And finally, their sixth goal that they're supposed to pursue is leadership, mobilizing leadership and having a whole of government approach. So meaning that mental health shouldn't be relegated just to as a health issue, but it should be seen as a workplace and housing and justice issue and so on. So all these are wonderful goals to have, and they've pursued them. And again, they reflect, in large part, the Senate report from Mr. Kirby back in the mid-2000s. Now, the problem with the Commission, I think, is that it focuses a little bit too much on the masses and not enough on the really difficult constituency, which is people with severe mental illness, those who need the most help. Someone who's suffering depression, they have a real illness and they need help, but it doesn't really compare to the challenges of someone living with severe treatment-resistant schizophrenia. And I think they've kind of left that constituency on its own and left it to community groups who don't have the resources. I think the Commission also places a little too much emphasis on the recovery model, this notion that everyone will get better and we'll all live happily ever after. Well, that's a nice story to tell, but it's not the story, it's not everyone's story. I think they put a little bit too much emphasis on the social science and not enough on the brain science, the hardcore stuff. Again, these are legitimate things for people with mild and moderate conditions, but less so for people with severe illness. I think the mental health strategy also underplays the importance of psychiatry and medications, and it gives a little bit too much credence to the so-called psychiatric survivors, people who are vehemently anti-treatment, who are some of my biggest fans in my mail that I get, as you can imagine from what I say. Now, I don't want to say that things like peer support and rights are not important, because they are. They're very important. But as I stressed in Jonah's story, they don't trump providing care for those who are really sick. That always has to be the end goal. So thirdly, let me talk about Bell Let's Talk. As you know, this is an initiative where Bell Canada urges people to tweet and text and call using a hashtag, Bell Let's Talk. And they make a donation of $0.05 for each one of these interactions. So last year, the most successful campaign yet, more than 122 million interactions. And if you're really good at math, you'll know that translates into $6.1 million. So that's a pretty good haul for one day. So, everybody knows about Bell Let's Talk. It's a marketing success, without question. Everybody knows and loves their spokesperson, Clara Hughes. And I've known her for a long time. I think she's a wonderful person, really committed and genuine. But the real question we have to ask is, does all this talking and tweeting, does it actually make life better for people with mental illness? I don't know that that's clear. Is Clara Hughes, a 6-time Olympian, as wonderful a person as she really the face of mental illness? Or is the face of mental illness more someone like Jonah Fluxgold? Those are uncomfortable questions that we don't ask often enough. And I don't want to stand up here and crap on Bell Canada. That's not my intention. I think there's been a sea change in the public discourse surrounding mental health and mental illness, and they've been a big contributor to that. So I think they should get credit for that. Also in large part because of Bell's initiative, I think big business now takes mental illness much more seriously. And having business on board is really essential to influencing politicians and policy. The reason a conservative government invested in a mental health commission is because business wanted it, because business will benefit from it. So let's have no illusions about that. It's really important. But for a corporation that has $20 billion a year in revenues, a gift of $6 million to mental health charities is really petty cash. And they get many times that amount of free PR. So for them, it's a business decision above all. And again, that's not a bad thing, but we have to be realistic and understand the limitations. And I don't want to be cynical about it. I don't want to cut down the good parts of it. But the reality is we can't expect corporations to be bold agents of social change. We can't expect them to tell the stories that I've told about Jonah, of the really uncomfortable stories. They'll tell the great recovery and survival stories of people with mild mental illness that get better happily ever after. The reality out on the ground is what? Medicare still doesn't cover psychological care. That goes back to this artificial distinction that happened when Medicare was created. Waits for psychiatric care can stretch for months, even over a year for children in most provinces. Young people who are literally starving to death because of eating disorders can wait months and months for admission to hospital. Many of them die while waiting. Waits for addiction treatment are even longer. And we know the severity of the addiction epidemic, of the opioid epidemic, among others, going on now. Imagine that you have a loved one, and you probably don't have to imagine in this room, a daughter, a husband, a grandmother, who's so depressed that they're unable to get out of bed in the morning, unable to go to school or to work. They're suicidal. But chances are in our health system, our overburdened health system, they may be deemed not sick enough to be admitted. they'll be sent back in the queue, just waiting. Waits are the Achilles heel of Canadian healthcare, and nowhere are waits worse and more damaging than with mental health. People can still be fired from their jobs because they have a mental health condition. The human rights protections are really, really weak. Way weaker than the civil rights protections that allow you to refuse care. Again, it's out of balance. On any given night, there are 20,000 people sleeping on the streets of our major cities in Canada, even in the dead of winter. And the majority of them, the vast majority, are suffering from mental illness. Those are people who used to be cared for in institutions. Now they're left to their own devices on the streets. Suicide is an epidemic in the country. 10 people a day die of suicide in Canada. It's especially bad in Indigenous communities. So it's nice to have a policy saying they're a priority, but what actions are we actually taking? Those are the everyday sad realities in Canada. Bell and others don't talk about these very real issues because they prefer the feel-good stuff. That's better marketing. Action needs to come from elsewhere than talking and texting initiatives. It has to come from the state, from elected officials, through to administrators of the health system. And it needs to come from the media. And that's the last group that I'll touch upon. I'll look at myself inward a bit. Media coverage of mental illness, as I've mentioned a couple of times in passing, has changed a lot in recent years, and I think it's changed for the better. I wrote my first major story about a person with a mental illness back in 1987. And it started off as a little story about a small group of parents who were protesting at Queen's Park in Toronto, and they were protesting for better treatment of their children with schizophrenia. So it was a group very much like this one, founded in the 1960s, called Friends of Schizophrenia. And I'm still friends with many of those parents to this day. And they had amazingly compelling stories, just heart-wrenching. And I wrote a story, quite a long piece, that featured one mom talking about her son who had taken his life after he was refused admission to hospital. Because they thought, he's not really serious, he's just faking this. He's acting crazy to try and get out of stuff. Well, he wasn't, he was seriously ill. The boy went home, he was a teenager, and in his psychotic state, he jammed 2 forks into his eyes, and he pounded his head into the kitchen counter until he died. This is how his mom found him. And I'm telling this story because she said, I remember very distinctly at the time telling me, I want you to tell this story in all its gory detail, because people have to understand what we live with. That's a fear she lived with for years, and her worst fears came true. Now, what happened to that story? Well, my paper, unfortunately, they cut that out. They didn't want me to tell that story. They said, and I remember this ringing in my ears from my editor saying, that's not the kind of thing people want to read over breakfast. I guess they want to read about genocide in Rwanda and the Paul Bernardo trial and so on, but they don't want to read about that. But it's just a reminder that mental illness and suicide in particular has always made us very, very uncomfortable. And the media has always covered it terribly. We've always refused to acknowledge the reality or its prevalence or its severity. The worst for me was the blanket rule that we had forever that we don't cover suicide. Why? Well, we didn't ever say explicitly, but essentially it was because it was shameful. You don't want that in someone's obituary. Imagine the lasting shame on the family. And before 1972, it was actually a crime to, at the time, it was commit suicide because it was a law. I don't know how you prosecuted someone for that, but there you go. But it led us to things to use euphemisms like guide sound, which everyone knew what they meant anyhow, so why weren't we more explicit? Now today we tell people's stories in all their messy detail. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it's better. It's better than hiding them in the shadows. When we do our job properly, we cover suicide like we cover any other death. No exceptions. We judge them strictly by their newsworthiness. Not whether it's a suicide or a murder, but sometimes murders are newsworthy, sometimes they're not. We have to apply the same standards. I was part of an initiative a couple of years ago called Mindset Guide, where a bunch of journalists, we got together and we wrote a style guide for other journalists on how to cover mental health appropriately. And there's all kinds of practical tips in there, and you could, these booklets are available for free if you want to use them within your group as well. I can arrange that. But what this booklet emphasized is how for far too long the media perpetuated stereotypes, and we worsened the stigma about people with mental illness, and how now we have an obligation to get things right and to try and correct our historical mistakes. Sort of a reconciliation, if you want to use common language today. And again, part of that one chapter in that booklet is about suicide specifically, saying, listen, you have to cover it like everything else. That's important. Now I want to wrap up because I'm out of time. And I want to have some time for interaction if you have questions or comments. But I just want to end with a couple of really quick closing thoughts. Now, I tried to stress tonight that mental health patients have always been the orphans of Medicare for a host of historical, social, political, and media reasons. In many ways, they still are. They're still not equal to others. George Orwell in 1984 talked about all the animals are equal, but some are a little more equal than others. And that's true today. Cancer is much more equal than mental illness in our society. Now, when the Mental Health Commission was launched back in 2007, followed by the Mental Health Strategy, I think what was important about that is that it was a commitment to correct an injustice. That's ultimately what it was, and we shouldn't forget that. Changing ingrained attitudes is an enormous undertaking, but it has to start with addressing the pervasive stigma in our society. That's changing, and it's changing rapidly. I'd like to see it change as rapidly as the change that came about with breast cancer. Now the good news is we have a Prime Minister today who speaks openly about mental health and mental illness. We have his spouse who's even more eloquent about the issue and even more open. She even talks about her personal issues with eating disorders, for example, and depression. In society, we've made some good progress on these issues, particularly on stigma. But we still have a tendency to look upon people with mental illness as weak rather than sick. We don't take their sickness as seriously as other illnesses. We still have a little bit of lingering doubt. We still equate severe mental illness with violence, which is one of the worst things we do in the media. People who suffer from mental illness are 11 times more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators of violence. They're victims all the time. Now, personally, I've never gotten as much hate mail as when I wrote about Vince Lee. Vince Lee is the so-called Greyhound bus killer. And I wrote that he should get care, not jail. Didn't make a lot of people happy. But I've followed his case closely, and Vince Lee is better now. He's a man who's remorseful, and he's well, and he should be in society. He never committed a crime. He was a victim of his illness. And these things make us uncomfortable, but we have to deal with them head on. Overcoming the kind of stigma that comes from crimes like that, or from actions like that, because I have to stress he didn't commit a crime, it's going to be hard, and it's going to be difficult. Most importantly of all, we need to remember that when you send out a message to people with mental illness, that it's okay to be open and to come forward, and that's how all these initiatives have sent that message. That comes with an implicit promise that there's going to be help. And that's where we've fallen down. We've broken that promise to deliver care when people come forward. And that's what we have to fix, and urgently. 1 in 4 Canadians who seek care for mental illness don't get it. They don't get it promptly. When they're hospitalized, the readmission rates are higher than any other condition. That means they're not treated adequately. Caregivers face the greatest burden of any caregiver at all, those who care for people with mental illness, because their burden is often lifelong and relentless, 24/7. The economic impact of having a mental illness is far more crushing than having any physical illness. Now, those are some of the examples of public policy failures that we have to address urgently. Those are the conversations we have to have. Not just at gatherings like this one, not just preaching to the converted, but we have to have them in society more generally, and of course at the highest levels of society. So let me just end by saying, long live the Friends of Mental Health, and congratulations for all the great work you've done, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak.